I'm joined today by Dr. Dan Pardi, PhD. Dan is the CEO of Humanos.me, which leverages a novel behavior model to promote health fluency, skill development, and lifestyle insights to help people master their health practice. He does research with the Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences Department at Stanford and the Departments of Neurology and Endocrinology at Leiden University in the Netherlands, where he investigates how lifestyle factors like sleep influence decision-making, cognitive performance, and metabolism. Dan also works with naval special warfare to help the most elite fighters in the world maintain alertness and capable mental performance under challenging circumstances. He currently serves as a board member for StandUpKids.org, as a council director for the True Health Initiative, an advisor to several health-oriented companies, Ample Meals, Fitstar, Splendid Spoon, Validage, and editor for the Journal of the Evolution and Health. Dan, thanks so much for taking the time out today.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be on your show, Mark.
Terrific. Well, before we dive in, can you give listeners a little bit more background on how you got into this area of sleep research?
Sure. I got into it very serendipitously. I was working in bioinformatics. So that's the application of computer processing to do a variety of things with the human genome. In this case, it was to try to sequence the human genome for the first time. So it was early 2000s. Anyway, kind of tangential to the story, but that whole field was essentially technology before market, and all 33 companies in the space went out of business. And I was my boss at the time introduced me to the executive vice president of a company that called Orphan Medical, and they had a drug for narcolepsy. And I went to work for that company, and then that company was bought by a company, Jazz Pharmaceuticals in Palo Alto, and I founded their medical affairs department, and I ran their research grant program, scientific publications for almost a decade. And in that time, I got to interact with many of the top sleep researchers around the world through advisory boards and through, discussing possible research collaboration. And then I also was able to publish some studies of my own and some papers of my own, which was a great opportunity. And I think that pretty immediately I developed a love for sleep and the science of it, and it's only grown over time. So I went back kind of later in my career to pursue a PhD. At the same time, I developed a behavior model to try to understand what is it that we need to do in order to help people maintain their health practice long term. So I developed a behavior model early in my PhD, and then so simultaneously I've been working on my research studies, and then I've also been developing an application. It's now called Dan's Plan, but very soon it'll be Humanos.me, and that's where I get to. It's kind of nice. I get to have one foot in research and then one foot where I try to translate the research into tools, techniques, applications, services that help people implement best class knowledge in their life. And so that's I like having that sort of duality of my, how I get to spend my days.
Absolutely. I mean, it's so important to have that boots on the ground practice as well, of really seeing what works in people, because sometimes the information is so clear, but it's just not easy to get people to do it. If we start the conversation around just like an evolutionary context of sleep, whether it's clinical practice or with athletes, we know we're trying to get more sleep for folks. The average person, about 6.5 hours of sleep, I guess it is now. So could you speak about, a few years ago, a study came out showing that a lot of the modern day hunter-gatherer tribes are actually not getting more sleep than we are. And so this sort of flip things on its head a little bit. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah. That was work done by Jerry Siegel and colleagues. Dr. Siegel is a pretty well-known neuroscientist at UCLA. He was one of the first people to unravel some of the neurocircuitry of narcolepsy. He's done work in all sorts of species to try to understand what does sleep look like across mammals. He's looked at sleep in narwhals to sleep in I almost think that more challenging it is to try to study the subject. I think he likes it, which I really admire. I think that's cool. So he, in this study in particular, he had gone to work with a group that was working with 3 different hunter-gatherer tribes, 2 in Africa, 1 in Bolivia, and they all, even though they were geographically separated, they were in somewhat of a similar position relative to the equator, one that we feel that humans have evolved under that condition. So temperatures range in this latitude somewhere between like 50 degrees and 90 degrees. So never too cold, never too hot. And so they looked at that. They instrumented these hunter-gatherers with actigraphy devices that measure movement, and they also were able to detect body temperature just from the periphery, and then environmental temperature and light. So they were triangulating these different signals to then try to understand over a period of time, what are the rest, activity, sleep patterns like in these hunter-gatherers. Now, one idea that has been put out there, which is a bit of a straw man argument, is that when sun goes down, that's when hunter-gatherers go to sleep, and when the sun comes up, that's when hunter-gatherers wake up.
For sure.
And that, I mean, I don't know that I've even heard that too much myself, because we know that they had fire. We know that in the literature, there's, interestingly, dancing is comprised a large part of the energy expenditure in hunter-gatherer populations. So the tribe gets together. I know, I love that. Yeah. So we know that they'd stay up past sundown, but that was confirmed in this population. And what they found is that although you would say that light is probably dictating their sleep period, approximately when the sleep is occurring, what had greatest fidelity with actually sleep onset and then sleep offset, or other words, waking up, was temperature change. And so they would notice this vasoconstriction or vasodilation in the fingertips when sleep would occur, so when they would go to sleep, and then the opposite when they would wake up, so this vasoconstriction. And the whole idea there is that this vasoconstriction and vasodilation is controlling the core body temperature, which is then cooling the brain down for sleep initiation, and then warming the brain up for waking. Excuse me. So that was a really interesting finding. It was a bit controversial. Other groups have not found that same occurrence. So what's cool is that there's now some more investigation into what is natural sleep, because you don't get that in a sleep lab. If you've ever had a polysomnography, which is how you get a sleep study done, you've got 27 leads attached to your head or all over your body, eyes, nose sometimes. Sometimes you have something called a PEZ, which is this cord that goes down your throat. I mean, how anybody can sleep during a sleep study is beyond me, but
exactly right.
Yeah, but they're important, right? They're not great at detecting natural sleep, but what they are good is detecting is pathological sleep patterns. So, restless leg syndrome, narcolepsy, sometimes insomnia, although not great with insomnia. But, so they have purpose, but kind of have to think like kind of the Heisenberg principle, right? So, anytime you are trying to observe a phenomenon, you actually change that phenomenon just by looking at it.
Yep.
And that's very much what's happening, in sleep studies. So now when you go out into the field, you obviously can't carry all of your serious equipment with you. And so you have to use more rudimentary, lighter weight devices to get them into the bush. And so what you kind of give up in terms of, technical sophistication, you gain in terms of people being able to do it and actually getting it into more of a naturalistic environment. So anyhow, one of the surprising findings is that and there's actually a really important point that needs to be made here, is that the National Sleep Foundation recommends people get 7 to 9 hours of sleep.
Yep.
All right. What Dr. Siegel found and his colleagues found is that on average, the hunter-gatherers were sleeping about, I think, around 5.9 to 6.5 hours per night. Wow, that sounds like a big difference. But the really important thing here is that if you were to report sleep, you don't say, if I were to say, hey, Mark, when did you go to sleep last night? Well, I went to bed at midnight. I woke up at 8, right? You wouldn't, and then I slept 8 hours. You wouldn't say, I went to bed at midnight. I woke up at 8, and I had 85% sleep efficiency, so I slept 6 hours and 42 minutes.
Exactly.
Right. Nobody reports their sleep that way, but that's what a sleep study would detect. Right. So that's why there's a discrepancy sometimes between sleep time and sleep period. When people talk about their sleep, they're really talking about sleep period. It was the period of time that they slept. And they don't have, so much, it's natural for people to wake up 15 to 20 times per night, little rollover, have brief bouts of awakening that you don't even remember. And that's very normal sleep. You just don't report on that, when you're telling a friend how much you slept. but sleep devices will pick that up. So while it sounds like we're not getting a lot of, that the hunter-gatherers were actually not getting that much sleep, their sleep period was identical. It was between 7 hours and 8.5 hours. That was the amount of time that they were sleeping. That was their sleep period.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and so it was, but they were on the lower end. They were definitely on the lower end of, So then there's a couple questions to be asked, like, do they have more efficient sleep? Do they need less deep sleep for some certain reasons? One question that came up with Dr. Siegel when I asked him on my podcast, Humanos Radio, I said, he asked me, he's like, well, how much sleep do you need for what? Right. And if you're, undergoing, really rigorous cognitive work day by day where you have to work for 10 hours and concentrate, you might need more sleep. And that sort of activity might promote more sleep at night. Versus if you have a lot of rest during the day versus, kind of shorter periods of intense work. So lots of questions came from that study. I'm going to be speaking at the Ancestral Health Symposium specifically on the subject. And while I've definitely done some investigation into it thus far, I look forward to spending more time with it and really analyzing all the literature for that presentation.
And of course, today with things, the things that tend to jump out with, seeing clients day to day in practice or even working with athletes, which maybe we'll get to here in a minute, but with your average clients, things like stress, things like the blue light exposure, alcohol intake in the evening, are all these things, driving our need for total sleep up?
Well, a lot of things can affect it subtly, and yet it's still, we don't have a perfect grasp over those influences because it's studied less, right? Because so much research is around clinical problems versus everyday,
Yep.
Influences. Although there is work on that for sure. But undoubtedly, I think everybody, physical activity is an interesting one because it kind of depends on the amount of work that the amount of physical activity you get and how much beyond the regular amount of physical activity you get, that can determine whether or not your sleep is better or actually worsened by physical activity. So if you regularly get physical activity, we know that's a good thing for sleep. If you typically get, let's say, arbitrarily 5 units of exercise, but you have one day you have 10 units or 15 units, you just get a lot more than usual, then that might disturb your sleep. It might be, or you could sleep like a rock. So, so you have a little bit more variability in how well you sleep, given how much exercise you got once you start to go beyond what you usually do. Yeah.
Definitely.
So,
and that's something that, if we do dovetail into the performance side of things, the work of Sherry Ma in terms of reaction time, sprint speed, things like 3-point shooting percentage, first serves in tennis. Her work in the NCAA athletes is showing that, that 10 hours per day or 70 hours per week as being something to sort of shoot towards for people who are, elite or high performers. Is that something that you see, or where's the research at this point with performance and sleep?
Yeah. So Sherry Ma's at Stanford. She's looked at, like you said, track athletes, tennis athletes, basketball, football, and then she looked to then see if performance was different between groups of athletes that were assigned to get more time in bed, so 9 hours per night, versus those that did not. And it's really good early pilot research, but it's not as well controlled because there could be other variables that are, of course, influencing changes in performance. But generally, the pattern is there, which means it's worth investigating further. And so one of the more interesting aspects about her work is that when all the different athletes were asked in the different studies, how do you feel? They all wrote down that they felt fine, essentially, in terms of like that way that information was collected. After they were assigned to the group to get more time in bed, so 9 hours per night, they all felt better. So their mood improved, their recovery improved. And then that led to, essentially markers of greater, system responsivity to whatever the task was. So whether it's shooting percentage, whether it's reaction time. And we know that reaction time is very sensitive to sleep time and sleep quality. So so all of these things can provide an advantage for an athlete if you're giving really good sleep, sometimes more than you even think, that can really lend to better performance and better recovery. So obviously you're challenging your body a lot. You need, kind of like a developing child, you need, as you're growing, and if you're an athlete, you're always in a state of like heightened, you want to be in a state of repair because you're really breaking your body down. You need to have that rest time in order to turn your effort into results that make you kind of a continually better athlete and a continually better performer. So the athlete side are your sprint times and your vertical jump, improving from your training, and then the athletic ability component is your percentage, your free throw percentage. Is that translating into results in the field or results in the court or whatever it is, in terms of playing the sport better.
Absolutely. I mean, a couple of things that jump to mind are obviously, college level athletes tend to lack of sleep for sure. So that's definitely a low hanging fruit. And then, with us at Canada Basketball, a lot of our young athletes obviously are, in the evening in their wind down period before bed, it's a lot of Instagramming and Twittering and this type of thing. So can you review sort of what that does? How much is that blue light really going to affect that deep sleep, particularly in athletes?
Yeah. There's been some work on, so I work in Jamie Zeitzer's Circadian Biology lab. Circadian Biology that's what we're talking about when we're talking about blue light. So we have a master clock in the brain. The master clock is looking for signals from the outside, and then once it gets those signals, it's affecting its own pattern of activity, which is then influencing what we call clocks in cells and tissues throughout our body. And it's a way for the brain to coordinate the timing of certain processes, whether it's cell cycle and repair, whether it's behavioral patterns, whether it's even your sleep-wake cycle is a circadian rhythm. Light is the major synchronizer of that rhythm. And so what you want to get, if you think about what would, if you were a hunter-gatherer, what would that look like? You'd get a lot of light during the day, and then when the sun went down, you'd have some light by fire only. So it was dim and of a certain tone. And then you'd go to bed and you'd have, a reasonable amount of darkness. It wouldn't necessarily need to be pitch black. But what we do now is we spend a lot of our time indoors. So the light intensity from outside is less than it would be if you were outside, much less. And then we also get more light in the evening when it would usually be dark. And so it's a very strange pattern of less light intensity during the day, but longer periods of light, and then less darkness. So you also think there's, our body's attuned to all sorts of signals and there's a certain amount of darkness that we evolved with, right? So even though that would change over the seasons, and during darkness, we produce melatonin, and melatonin has broad effects in the body. It's a really powerful antioxidant, and also something that will reinforce. It reinforces what's called the dark period. So it helps to once its light is coming into the eye, then stops coming into the eye, then that will initiate this darkness chemical, and that tells the rest of the body that it's dark out, and then that helps to prime the body for certain dark time activities. So it's not necessarily a sleep hormone, because we know that there are nocturnal animals that have high melatonin as well. So it's more of a timing hormone, although it does have slight soporific effects in humans, which means that it does promote a little bit of sleepiness in humans. And so anyway, when you're getting bright light into the eye late at night, that can have a really serious impact on your reaction time the next day, your mood, just how well your body is functioning. And so while it's really difficult to stop people from using Instagram and their phones at night, there are some things it's really hard, right? Because that's our time to relax and just kind of be by ourselves, and humans will always take a little time for themselves. And nowadays that's how we do it, right? We're either watching television or we're playing, on some social media site because essentially we construct those social media sites to be of interest to us,
for sure.
Right? And so you get to scroll through your interest feed, and it's captivating. So, well, I think it's good to try to maintain some good hygiene around those products. So, all right, I'm going to turn it off at this time. Another way to do it is to then modify the light that's coming out of it,
for sure,
so that it's less of a negative influence. It's telling the brain there's a less strong of a signal that's saying to the brain it's day when it's actually nighttime, and you will perform much, much better when you implement some of those techniques into your life. And I interviewed my own mentor, Jamie Zeitzer, and in that blog, so if you go to blog.danceplan.com, you look for Jamie Zeitzer. I give you a way that you can actually go beyond night shift, which is the now built into the iOS systems on iPhone, which can help your screen turn more yellow tone at night. And I can take it a step farther by something called color shift. So I give you very specific instructions about how to do that. But whenever I'm reading in bed, I use color shift, and that really helps to remove that blue light. I perform better the next day. And you've got to remind yourself, like, I'm going to perform better the next day. That's why I'm doing this, because obviously it's, more pleasant to look at a screen that has the full colors there. So you got to consider that too.
For sure. No, that's great. I will definitely link to that in the show notes. And something that comes to mind is, a lot of our younger athletes are seeing a pattern now of, prescriptions for melatonin at younger ages and teens and university. I was just wondering your thoughts on that, if it's really more on the hygiene side that we should be focusing, or if small doses of supplemental things like melatonin could be beneficial for certain populations, or perhaps even in teens and collegiate athletes.
It is, it's interesting. I mean, whenever you're taking a hormone, you want to be careful about whether or not your pattern of taking a supplementary hormone is affecting your internal ability to produce it. And yet, kind of like vitamin D, right? We take supplementary vitamin D, which is a hormone, because we're not getting enough. And so there could be some evidence there. I mean, there could be some, rationale for actually taking small doses of exogenous melatonin in order to help really entrain that dark period. But again, more than telling your brain that it's than helping you go to sleep. I mean, melatonin is here's the problem with melatonin. It's a very, very weak soporific, as I mentioned before. So it's not very powerful at making you sleepy, although it does a little bit. So in order to then sort of maximize the effects of the sleepiness of melatonin, people take extraordinarily high doses, milligram doses, 3 milligram, 5 milligrams, sometimes more. And that can create levels of melatonin in your blood that are, 65 times higher than what you would naturally see. Okay, is that necessarily a problem? I just don't. I'm not one who wants to run necessarily a experiment like that in a young person.
For sure.
So if you're going to be taking melatonin, one way to do it would be to take it 0.3 milligrams, very small dose. It's not going to make you sleepy, but it is going to give your brain a signal that it's dark out. Even if you have, it's kind of the equivalent of wearing blue light blocking glasses. Awesome. And you'd want to take that when you're, when you're going to bed, when the sun is going down. So there's a couple ways you could do it, right? You could try to mimic what's happening in kind of your natural cycle outside, light dark cycle, or you could make it a rule of saying, I'm going to just take this small amount, 2 hours before bed, and set an alarm and then do it that way. And that's going to help prevent some of the shifting of your circadian rhythm that can happen when you have inadequate light during the day and then too much light right before bed. So that's one strategy. The other strategy is to wear glasses. And so that's what I tend to do, is to put on glasses. I have an alarm that goes off. I put on my glasses 2 hours before bed. They're blue light filtering glasses. And, I think in order to be healthy in our world, you got to be a little weird. And
for sure.
You really do.
No, I recently saw a study came out, and this is one that I can definitely attest to, having gone sort of backwoods camping, portaging, and whatnot, and how with no artificial light, it's amazing how by 8 or 9 p.m. I mean, you're just tired, and you fall asleep quite nicely. And so studies came out showing that camping can be a nice way to sort of reset some of the circadian rhythms. I just wondering your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so that's done by Kenneth Wright out of University of Colorado. Ken does great work. My mentor Jamie and Ken were at Harvard at the same time getting their PhD under Chuck Zeisler, who's like the godfather of circadian biology and sleep.
Terrific.
And Ken, I really like all the work that Ken does. I just spoke about some of his studies last week at Paleo Effects, and that are unrelated. But yeah, he's done studies now. In this case, he brought people out to a camping environment, measured their melatonin levels, and they totally changed over the course of a couple of days compared to what they were prior to, in their modern life. So I think any sort of technology that helps you emulate a more natural pattern that's my my most optimistic view of tech is to help us live a pattern that is more natural versus, then I'm open to, but cautious with technology that's meant to like make us be superhuman in some ways. Sometimes it feels like you're superhuman if you're just living more naturally. But anything that's trying to, transcend our own biology, then it's like, okay, I'm open to it, but let me see the data. So that's a little aside. But anyway, so this sort of study where you get out there and you go camping can be really powerful. And another lesson from it is, what if you just were to do this a couple times a year? Could that have some positive impact on our physiology by maintaining a natural rhythm for a period of time? And actually, I published a study in the Journal of Evolution of Health probably 6 or 7 months ago, talking about a 4-day camping trip where people were emulating a Paleolithic pattern of living. So they went, they fasted every morning. They had 2 meals a day. They were sleeping on outside and under natural on these natural platforms that they would build for 4 nights. And so the food was there was fasting. The food was all designed to be paleo-like. They were walking a lot, and they had really impressive results. Even these were all healthy people that were from an athletes' university in Germany, and they even then they had pretty significant changes in their blood markers: fatty liver index, insulin sensitivity, body weight. Wow. It wasn't controlled for weight loss. I know. So again, what's normal might not necessarily be optimal, and they all moved in the direction of what you see with hunter-gatherers, and that was only 4 days. So could some sort of short trip to where you're living much more naturally be a therapeutic option for people that have certain conditions? Of course, it's rigorous and challenging, but it's also potentially very healthy for us.
100%. I mean, it's amazing how just a little bit of more exposure to nature and the natural environment can really reboot health and cognitive function. And I know you spoke on sleep and weight gain recently. Was it the Paleo Effects? Can you share some of the latest insights on that research?
Yeah, sure. So I'll try to summarize the work. So I gave a bit of a history about a lot of the work that's gone on in the area. I started off talking about timing, right? So we were talking about circadian rhythms. That's really talking about body timing and what you want, your body to function best, and that how that translates into performing best on the court, performing best in your life, having a good positive mood, being your favorite version of yourself in every way. You really want your rhythms to be synchronized and working together. So imagine a symphony playing, right? And if some of the symphony is a couple measures off, then it's not going to be optimal at all. And that's what a really strongly aligned circadian rhythm will do for you, is it helps your body work at its optimal function. So one idea that I brought up is this researcher, Dina Arbel. She had taken mice and she fed them the same amount of calories, and she also monitored their physical activity and found that they got the same amount of physical activity. Now the difference was that they fed one group all their calories when they usually sleep. So same amount of calories, but what they found is that over a 6-week period, the group that was getting their calories at a time when they usually sleep had a significant increase in weight gain compared to the other group.
Wow.
And so they gained a lot of fat. A lot of the weight gain was fat as well. Next, Laura Fonkin, who's somebody that I had on my podcast not too long ago, instead of feeding mice at a time when they were overweight, what she did is she fed mice the same amount of calories and had the same amount of activities, the same. But one group, while they were sleeping, again, and their sleep time was when they usually slept, she had dim light on at night. So their sleeping cages, instead of being in darkness, they were in light. And what do they find is that the mice then wanted to eat later and later every night. And they too then had statistically significant increases in body weight compared to the group that was getting the same amount of calories and had the same amount of physical activity over time. And so timing really matters. And I published a blog probably a year ago now, but talking about some work out of the Weizmann Institute and where essentially we make different enzymes that are suited for certain caloric needs or certain, to help us metabolize different sorts of substrates at different times. And so the timing of food really, really matters. I'm going to record a podcast tomorrow with Greg Potter and Jeff Rothschild on this very subject. And so there's still more to be worked out there, but we obviously know that fasting and time-restricted feeding windows are becoming very popular. And the circadian, whenever you're talking about fasting and time-restricted feeding, we're also really talking about circadian biology too. And so that's a very interesting, promising field.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing stuff as well for regular folk who are just trying to improve their health or lose weight, because just being able to synthesize this to some simple, straightforward approaches, as in, don't eat too much food after dinner or after 7 p.m. or whatever it might be, that we're seeing in the findings is sort of an amazing way to achieve a lot of these benefits without making things too complicated, isn't it?
You're absolutely right. And the easier we can make it, then the better, because then the guidance is simple, it's easy to implement, and you can have, one thing that we know is anything that can have a hard and fast rule that is easy to remember and implement, or, at least easy to remember so that it's easier to implement, it can be very effective. Kind of like the carbs are bad, from a while ago. While it's not true, it's effective, because what it does is it gives you this easy to follow heuristic that can help people make better food choices. Now, the problem with that is, of course, it's not entirely true, but it's still effective. So that's what leads to a lot of, debate on the internet about, how should we be educating on this subject. But anyway, that's another subject.
For sure. I mean, it's always interesting how, it's, even prescribing sort of a lower carb diet. Like you said, in the short term, you just take away all the processed food, the sugars, etc. So you do get gains, but, whether the total calories obviously still being important and various other things. So it's almost like giving people enough information that they need at the time, and then furthering the discussion down the road once things plateau, right?
Yeah, actually, I wrote a blog on ketones and carbs, and I'll send it to you. It was probably the most popular blog post I'd ever written. I got a lot of traction at the time it came out. But I talk about how I used a saying that it might be that while we have to cut carbs in order to get into ketosis, oftentimes it was described that the carbs were the problem, so you had to cut them so much, and that ketosis was kind of a secondary result, versus ketones are the desired result. You have to cut carbs to get there, but the carbs aren't necessarily bad themselves. And so, in fact, a high-fat diet that's not generating ketones actually might be problematic for a lot of people. So it might be darkest before the dawn, if you will. And anyway, it's worth taking a look if people are interested in the subject, I think.
Yeah, 100%. And finally, on the sleep and weight gain, obviously people now, what is it, 30% of the population now aren't even getting 6 hours of sleep per night. Is this another sort of just low-hanging fruit for folks to just get to bed earlier to help with, whether it's cravings, etc., that lead to excessive caloric intake and weight gain?
Yeah, so I only partially addressed your question, but I'll take a circuitous route to answer that one. So there's the other component aside from timing that I spoke to was the metabolic effects, and so we know that sleep loss is a stressor. And when you are awake, you have greater activity of your sympathetic nervous system than you do in your sleep. And so if you're spending more time awake, then you have, just by nature of being awake, you're now spending more time in a 24-hour period under control of the sympathetic nervous system. Downstream of that is activation of the HPA axis and the release of cortisol. And if you're over-releasing cortisol, at least in terms of what your body balance desires, you can develop cortisol resistance at tissues. And cortisol, it helps to quell inflammation. And so if your tissues become insensitive to cortisol, then it's something that can contribute to chronic low-grade inflammation. We see that with Cushing's syndrome or people that are on prednisone. Cushing's syndromes are people that produce a lot of cortisol as part of that condition and develop abdominal obesity and higher levels of adiposity. So we know that sleep loss is a stressor. And we've seen now some work by Josie Broussard, who's now at the University of Colorado in the Department of Kenneth Wright as well. And she's looked at a couple nights of sleep loss on fat tissue and notice that the insulin's effectiveness at doing its job at storing carbohydrates in your blood into fat tissue was massively reduced even after just a few nights of sleep loss. And so what happens then is that you have to release more insulin in order to generate an effect. So that's it can drive insulin up. And it can also drive high levels of fasting glucose, et cetera. So that's why people that are healthy under 4 or 5 nights of sleep loss, they'll look like pre-diabetic in terms of if you were to do an oral glucose tolerance test on them. So now if your life is defined by, your weeks not getting enough sleep and then on the weekends playing catch up, you're essentially, the risk is that you are promoting a pre-diabetic and diabetic state. And that's exactly what was found. So if you kind of think about the mechanism, so that we see that there's this cellular resistance to insulin after sleep loss, you see a clinical effect of increased blood sugar in healthy people after a few nights of sleep loss. And then finally, if you look at epidemiology, a study by Dan Gottlieb at Boston, he looked at 1,500 people and looked at whether and grouped them so majority of the people were getting 7 to 8 hours of sleep, but just like you said, 30% of the sample was getting less than 6 hours. And if you were getting less than 6 hours of sleep, then that short sleep time associated with diabetes and impaired glucose tolerance, and these are under conditions of sleep deprivation that are highly prevalent, right, in the United States. So that's a big problem. That's a really big problem.
For sure, especially walking around an environment that's going to be chock full of processed food and sugar and all these things that are going to be obviously really hyper palatable, and your brain will likely be wanting more and more, right, after all the sleep deprivation.
Well, that's a good segue to the next part. So we look at how sleep loss is influencing the kind of metabolism of substrates poorly. But then we also see that energy regulating hormones like leptin, leptin is a fat-derived hormone that signals to the brain energy status of so how much energy you have on your body. And when leptin goes down, that drives a hunger program that really wants you to take in food, and that stores everything that you take in. And so we see that leptin alters under sleep loss, so that it goes down, which is going to promote feeding. And we also know that ghrelin, which is a hormone released from the stomach, that is involved in a variety of things, including especially in hunger generation and reward. And so ghrelin goes up. So if you're thinking about leptin going down and ghrelin going up, both of those independently are going to cause you to eat more food. And that's exactly so Karen Spiegel's work she's out of Lyon, France, but was doing work with Evan Cotter at the University of Chicago, who's probably the single name in sleep and metabolism. She's a center of excellence. So a lot of the people who are doing work in the space came out of her lab at some point and are now either there still or somewhere else around the world. But
wow.
And so they found that what was interesting is that when people got less sleep, they ate more. But not only were they eating more, but there seemed to be a preference for originally it was high carb food. So that was interesting. What's going on there? And then what Rachel Markwald found, she's also with Kenneth Wright. They found that if you're spending more time awake, you're burning more calories, and so it actually makes sense for your homeostatic hormones to adjust in a way where you're going to then want to eat more the next day. You're just compensating for that extra energy expenditure. The problem is that people overconsume, so they're eating more than what you would estimate they would need in order to just get back to a baseline.
For sure.
And so where are all those calories coming from? Well, if you look across the meals in her studies, breakfast was normal, lunch was normal, dinner was normal. They were all having post-dinner snacks. So that's where a lot of the calories came from. And if you remember Laura Fonken's study where she had dim light at night, and the mice were consuming more of their calories later in their evening, quote unquote, if you will, that caused weight gain. And then, so that's kind of what we're seeing here, is that they had more calories late in the evening when they were under sleep deprivation.
That's obviously a common, working downtown Toronto, people, a busy day. By the end of the day, they get on the couch, they get a chance to decompress after dinner, and all of a sudden it's a, sweet or salty snack to get a little comfort in the brain and just an moment of relaxation. And of course, it seems to program in where every night, over and over again, this sort of happens. And so, as you mentioned, some of those, low-hanging fruit of perhaps just pulling the Band-Aid off and getting those late meals, crossing those off the list can be a great way to reboot body composition.
Yeah, it's really true. And I'll mention one other a study from Erin Hanlon, also at the University of Chicago, and what she looked at was endocannabinoids, right? So we all know that if you smoke pot, like a common side effect of that is getting the munchies. Well, we have our own endocannabinoid system. So this affects, pain regulation, hunger, mood. It's this master system in our body that is helping to regulate metabolism, definitely involved in food intake. And under sleep deprivation, you see during the day that your levels of 2-arachidonyl glycerol, which is one of the endocannabinoids, is elevated for most of the day. And the food intake actually corresponds with the rise in endocannabinoid levels. So you think about, and what do you get the munchies for? Do you get the munchies for, celery? No, it's typically like snack foods, like palatable, cookies or chips or whatever.
For
and
sure.
That is what that system is driving. It's pleasure mediated eating. So Utah, in their study, there was a drive for increased carbohydrates and fats, but then there was a decreased hunger for protein. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's sort of what you see in clinical practice as well, right? People, unfortunately, not snacking on grass-fed beef or sardines at 10 o'clock at night, right?
Yeah, it's like a cookie, a snack, or sometimes, maybe it's like a piece. It's a lot of calories, piece of pizza, but it's easy to take in a lot of calories right before bed, and that can mess up your sleep a little. There's a little bit of work on that. I think that there's room for optimization by eating earlier in the night.
Mm-hmm.
But then, we also know that it's the effects, the work that's been done on food and eat and sleep behavior, a lot by Maurice Pierre Saint-Onge. You just, over the course of the day, if you have more fiber and adequate protein, then you tend to have greater and slow wave sleep at night. So you have deeper, higher quality sleep. And if you have more sugar and saturated fat, this is in her study, then that correlated with greater arousals and lighter, more fragmented sleep.
That's so interesting. I mean, another thing that typically comes up with busy type A's, executives here working downtown Toronto, is this idea of travel, plane travel with work, the impacts there on, of course, circadian rhythm and blood sugar control and inflammation, things like that. Can you comment on that?
Yeah. So, going back to the idea of the circadian rhythm stuff, that when you're traveling across time zones, you're constantly putting if you think about what jet lag is, it is putting your body in a state where it is now struggling to taking in the signals of your new environment and trying to adjust your physiology so that it matches with those new environmental signals. And if you're going to, let's say, a place that's several hours away from where you live, by a plane, and then you travel back, your body is trying to adjust once it gets there, and then it has to readjust all the way when it gets back. And so if somebody's traveling regularly for work, that can be really rough on our biology. I noticed in my own research, if just variabilities, let's say somebody gets 8 hours of sleep per night, but they have high variability in their sleep time and their wake time, that was enough to cause significant impairments in subjective sleepiness. So feeling, I feel sleepy every day, or objective reaction time, which is another way to monitor sleepiness or alertness levels. And so the reaction time slows down. So if you think about that, is the way how quickly information can come into the brain, be processed, is transfer across the different brain areas that are needed in order to be able to make decisions, to have a functioning working memory, et cetera. All of those are diminished. Those functions are diminished. And gosh, I mean, how anybody works under those conditions is tough. But we know also that there's pretty serious disease consequences too. So the nurses who do shift work, if you look at the nurse health study, they have 4 or 5-fold increases in cancer risk and cardiovascular disease risk. It's really, our body is not used to that sort of environmental condition. So what do you do? Well, my mentor, he was Jed Black. He was the director of the Stanford Sleep Clinic for about 15 years. He was working with a Swiss pharmaceutical company. And so he was going there once a month. He'd go for a week and come back. And what he would do is he would basically try to adjust as little as possible so that he was going to bed, let's see, I think it was earlier here and then later there to try to minimize how much he was shifting. And then, and then he once he got there, he had a time to fully adjust, and then he had time to fully adjust back. But it was still, it took a bit of a toll. So those that are traveling very regularly across time zones, that's risky. But there is some new technology that's coming out that might actually ameliorate some of those effects. My mentor being the person who invented the science, or that at least, excuse me, I mean he. Described the science first, and then a company is commercializing it, but he has no financial interest in it. And the idea is that if you use light pulses at night with this eye mask by Lumos Tech, then that can actually synchronize, or that can move your circadian rhythm, the timing of your circadian rhythm, faster than just getting light from outside or even continuous light in the room. So if you're sleeping in a room with the light on, that can move your circadian rhythm. But if you have these light pulses at the right time, depending on where you're going and where you're coming from, then that can actually adjust it more quickly. So you could cut the amount of time you need to fully adjust to a new time zone down by maybe 2/3, which is really, really beneficial. That means you're spending sometimes maybe 5, 6, 7 days less in sort of this metabolic disarrangement. So
that's incredible. Yeah, I was going to ask. I mean, obviously with Canada basketball, we have our athletes, obviously in the NBA and playing in other professional sports who are traveling so much, or people who are crossing over from the U.S. to the U.K. or Europe. So I was going to ask things around light exposure or meal timing, if those are potential strategies. But it sounds like this new technology provides potentially a lot of potential benefit.
Yeah, it does. All those things you mentioned would complement a smart strategy for athletes, because they're a perfect example. They're traveling a lot. But they also have, hopefully, with a well-constructed program across the entire organization, that the athletes, even though their time is adjusting, or the timing of where they are is, the time zone is changing, that their own sleep time and their wake times are consistent. So if they're in New York, then, they're going to bed later according to the clock, but then if they go to bed at, if they're on the West Coast, then they're going to bed, earlier. But the actual biological timing is the same no matter where they are. And if they can keep that the same, then you're, which athletes have more of a luxury of doing, because they're not going to have 8 a.m. meetings necessarily when they arrive in the different time zones, which some people do have that. And then late dinners, right? So that's like the problem with like the business traveler, right? So they're early meetings in the time zone. Like if I travel, I'm in San Francisco time. If I travel to New York, if I have an 8 a.m. meeting, then that means I need to get up at like 3:30 my biological time, which obviously I don't get up at that time. So that's really hard. And the body can tolerate that, but the more you put your body in it, then it's not clearing out toxic substances in the brain. It's not forming memories as strongly as it should, and it's a major stressor. And that's going to age you faster. It could cause chronic disease. It's an issue. It's an issue.
And on that note of, if we dovetail into kind of sleep and longevity, oftentimes clients, obviously when they get older, they report, not needing as much sleep or waking more frequently through the night. Is that something that's quote unquote normal, or is this something that's just increasing in frequency in the population for other reasons?
Yeah, so we are trying, the research is trying to figure that out. We do know that sleep does change across the lifespan. We know that people that tend to be healthy agers tend to have good sleep, although it's not, that population is not really well characterized, but that has been observed multiple times in certain studies that, healthy agers are healthy sleepers. We also know that poor sleep was thought to be symptomatic of different brain conditions, Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, and it's now thought to be causative, especially of Alzheimer's disease. And it makes perfect sense that it would be causative. So why is that? Well, there's an area of the brain, the medial prefrontal cortex, which is important for generating slow-wave sleep. Slow-wave sleep is a phase of sleep that is necessary to it does some very important things in the body, like clearing out, again, these neurotoxic substances that accumulate with wake time activity. So just the normal process of being awake can create these substances that, if not cleared, can cause problems in your neurons. And you clear them during this very specific zero point 0.4 to 1 hertz sleep that is generated by this medial prefrontal cortex. And what's interesting is that when you don't get enough sleep, then you can accumulate these protein aggregates called beta amyloid. And where's the first place that you will start to aggregate them is in the medial prefrontal cortex, the area responsible for generating the sleep to clear those toxic substances.
Gotcha.
And so it's this vicious cycle. And once that happens, then you also can develop more of the tau pathology, which is also part of the Alzheimer's disease. There's a lot of, it is that sort of accelerated downward spiral. And then the worse sleep that you're getting, the less likely you are to feel physically active. The less physical activity you get, the worse sleep you get. The worse sleep you're getting, the more, the harder it is to be social. The less, you could really see the acceleration of the aging phenotype with poor sleep. So I like to focus on the things that you can do to get good sleep. And soon we're going to have technologies that intervene to actually override our physiology in some ways that are really exciting. Because it might actually help mimic more youthful sleep for longer, and that actually then therefore might help us feel younger for longer too.
Wow, that's really really interesting. At the moment, I mean, in terms of technology or ways to assess sleep, if it's just somebody's ability to fall asleep and waking in the morning, apps, tech, what can people go to really determine if they're sleeping optimally?
Yeah, so I think right now we've got quantified self, which is assessing. Well, it doesn't mean it's self-tracking. That's what that means. What you are tracking depends on the company and what they try to focus you on. And I think that there have been companies out there that were giving you feedback on certain stages because they were able to monitor them. But then that can sometimes be distracting as well. So my technique because I have a tracking platform, Humanos is really robust in that, in this component, is to help you track behaviors that get you good sleep. So are you getting adequate amounts of physical activity in your life, and how much is adequate? Is it more the better? Probably not. And then are you also doing very mundane activities? I call it the mundane but meaningful, right? So going to bed on time, planning to get enough time in bed. No guarantee that you're going to sleep well, but you're not going to get 8 hours of sleep if you're in bed for 6.
For sure.
Right. So setting goals, and one of the simplest is having a bedtime goal. So I want to be in bed by 11:30 every night. So if I'm then at the point where I'm, in bed trying to sleep, where it's like, well, I'm going to watch another episode of, Game of Thrones or House of Cards or whatever. No, so that you kind of need that sort of intervening tech to help us self-regulate a bit better, because, we know how to design technology, including television shows, entertainment that is so captivating that it can, right? It's that binge watching type of phenomenon that, the next episode just starts if you don't push stop, and it just keeps you in that loop. And then you're tired and you have poor inhibitory control, and it,
keeps going on itself for sure.
Yeah, and you can reliably just miss out on another half an hour, 45 minutes of sleep every night, and the effects of sleep loss accumulate. So it doesn't mean that you can't purge, have some benefit of purging them. But if you were to stay up, let's say you needed 8 hours of sleep, but you went to bed you only got 7 for a week, you'd perform okay, but you would, objective measures of cognitive performance would show significant changes, and yet a lot of people live that way.
Yeah, it's definitely something that it's amazing all the work that you do and the insights that you provide. And of course, I want to respect your time here today. So shifting gears to the last topic here, your morning routine. Can you give us some insights? Are you a coffee drinker? What does the morning look like for you?
Yeah, I do drink coffee. So I wake up and I usually just go right to the shower, and then the last minute of my shower I make ice cold, as cold as I can. And I have acclimated to that. So what I recommend people do is do over the course of a month, just make it cool. So take a warm shower, then make it cool towards the end, and then increasingly make it colder and colder until your body can handle it. But you want to get that sympathetic nervous system shock with the cold water. And what that can do is that it can serve as a signal to align your circadian rhythm. So it's almost like getting, outside lights. There are other factors that will influence the timing of your circadian rhythm. So that's one of the reasons why I like to take a cold shower first thing in the morning. And actually, if you acclimate to it in the right way, you can look forward to it because it makes you feel really alert right out of the gates.
For sure. Better than an espresso and squats in the morning.
Yeah. So speaking of which, then I usually will do a little bit of exercise, not a ton. I developed something called InTune training. So it stands for integrative and opportunistic training. And the whole idea of that is to then integrate movement into your day. So instead of just doing your whole workout at once, which I'm not opposed to. To offer another solution, InTune, you have totals. And so we put out a workout every day, and people will see this when we launch Humanos. And then the idea is, okay, you've got 16 hours to accumulate these rep totals.
Awesome.
And so I love it. And basically I do a few of those reps every morning. So a cold shower, and then instead of I either drink coffee or now I take nootropics. So I take Qualia from Neurohacker Collective. No relationship with them, but I like the product, and that has caffeine in it as well. That's another thing that can actually help to kickstart the circadian rhythm, keep it aligned. And so a little bit of physical activity, and kind of depending on my timing and my energy levels, I always do a little. I commit to very little, so I get started, and then from there, then I might just do a little bit more, but. If I keep my barrier of entry low, then I'm much more likely to do my first few reps. And if I do my first few reps, I'm much more likely to finish them by the end of the day, all my reps.
That is a great point. I see that all the time in clinical practice. Just do one push-up or one squat, and all of a sudden everyone's doing 30, 40, 50. It's amazing how that goes. Awesome, Dan. Well, really appreciate you making the time today. Where can people keep up with your fantastic work?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, so all these things that we're talking about, I'm trying to integrate into an application that just makes it easier for people. And part of that is trying to make people more expert at their own health, because I think that technology, while helpful, works much better in people that understand its value and that are taking the time to understand their health well. I'm sure a lot of your listeners are. So Humanos is going to launch in a few weeks. I've been working on it for about 5 years. I'm really excited about it. And we're making peer-reviewed health courses. We have a whole tracking platform that lets you track things that are really helpful to monitor your pattern of living, and then also just ways to simplify your daily health practice. So workouts and recipes and things like that too. So check it out. So if you go to humanos.me right now, it'll probably redirect you to Dan's plan, and then within a week or two, we'll probably be making the switch.
Fantastic. Well,